All of us have those periods where life can get a little rough. You get a bad evaluation at work. Your family does nothing but fight. Your dog gets sick, and you have to pay an unexpected bill. Well, hopefully no one has tried to kill you. Twice. In 3 weeks. You know who can't say that? Former United States President Gerald Ford. In September 1975, 2 different women tried to kill President Ford 2 different times. Both of these assassination attempts, which occurred in California over a 17-day time span, were amateur. Thankfully, both failed. However, it goes without saying that they would have changed this country. Given that they would have occurred a mere 12 years after the assassination of President Kennedy, it's safe to say that they would have extracted a grave toll from a country that was still reeling from the Watergate scandal. First, on September 5th, 1975, President Ford was in Sacramento, the capital of California. The backstory of how Ford wound up there is actually weirdly petty. The Democratic governor of California, Jerry Brown, broke a tradition which was to speak at the host breakfast. With a name as stupid as that, you can probably guess that the audience was pretty self-important. It was a group of wealthy California business leaders. With Brown saying no, the group invited Ford, who accepted, and headed to California to speak at this event, hold meetings, and attend fundraisers. The attempted assassin in this story was a woman named Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm. At the age of 19, Fromm met Charles Manson, the cult leader and murderer, at a bus stop where she had just been thrown out by her parents. She became one of his most devoted followers, even serving briefly in jail for contempt of court when she refused to testify against Manson. After Manson's cult, known as the Family, disintegrated, Fromm formed a new religion, the International People's Court of Retribution. As part of that group, Fromm and her cohorts would attack corporate executives and people who she believed were enemies of the environment. Fromm renamed herself Red after the California redwood trees. Fromm was deeply passionate about California's redwood trees. These trees, among the largest in the world, are believed by some to be sacred. Fromm was genuinely concerned that the United States was killing these trees, and that the federal government was not taking enough measures to protect them. As such, she decided to kill the president. On September 5th, Ford attended the host breakfast. He returned to the Senator Hotel and began his walk from the California Capitol building, greeting onlookers and shaking hands along the way. As an aside, is this not the strangest thing in the world? The president very casually walking public streets and sidewalks, and yeah, he was surrounded by police and Secret Service, but you would never get that close to the president today. And we soon found out why. Among those lined up to greet the president were Squeaky Fromm. Fromm, dressed entirely in red, had borrowed a weapon from a friend. When Ford was 2 feet from her, she pulled the weapon from her robe, pointed it at the president, and fired. Fromm's ignorance about how the gun worked may have saved Ford's life. Fromm didn't know that there was no round in the chamber, and that she had to pull back the gun slide to load the weapon. Fromm would later say that she intentionally made that error, having not actually wanted to kill Ford. So, with no round in the chamber, Fromm pulled her weapon and fired. But the gun never went off. Onlookers described hearing a metal click. Fromm was restrained immediately by the Secret Service and onlookers, who hustled Ford away from the crowd. Fromm was heard to scream, "It didn't go off," before being tackled and having the gun wrestled from her hands by the Secret Service. While being dragged away, Fromm screamed, "This country is a mess. This man is not your president." Ford was half dragged to the California Capitol building, and he wasn't too happy about it, instructing the Secret Service to, quote, "put me down," so he could walk into the building under his own power. The rest of his day, including a meeting with California Governor Jerry Brown, went as planned. Ford would deliver remarks to the members of the California legislature. The topic of the speech was crime. Ford would go 17 days before being the victim of another assassination attempt, and this one came much, much closer. On September 22nd, 1975, Ford was back in California. Specifically, he was in San Francisco, where he was addressing the World Affairs Council. At 3:30 p.m., his speech concluded, and Ford left the St. Francis Hotel. He walked outside the main entrance of the hotel and waved to a gathered crowd that was outside of his limousine. Enter Sarah Jane Moore. Like Squeaky Fromm, or honestly most people that attempt to kill the President of the United States, Moore had a troubled background. She had married and divorced 5 times by 1975 when she got into radical politics. During that time period, she became involved with numerous groups, including the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the United Prisoners Union, and the Symbionese Liberation Army. Moore would later inform on these groups to the FBI. Moore couldn't hold a job and had abandoned at least 3 of her children. Her history of being an FBI informant as well as her association with numerous radical groups, fueled extreme paranoia, and she feared being killed by either the groups that she associated with or the FBI. Now, interestingly enough, on 2 occasions, law enforcement could have prevented this assassination attempt. Moore's political activities earned her an examination by the Secret Service in 1975, but they dismissed her as not being a threat to the president. Then, the day before she fired at Ford, she was picked up by the police for illegally possessing a handgun. Now, the police let her go, but critically, they did confiscate her gun. Back to September 22nd. Moore was 40 feet away from the president. As Ford waved to the crowd before getting into her limousine, Moore fired a .38 caliber revolver. She had purchased the gun that morning and didn't know that the sights were 6 inches off. Moore fired 2 shots. The first hit a doorway behind Ford, a mere 5 inches above his head. Before she could fire the second shot, Moore was tackled by a bystander named Oliver Seipel. This caused the second shot to go astray. It wound up hitting a taxi driver named John Ludwig in the groin. Ludwig would recover. Ford was pressed down behind the limousine, ultimately hustled into it, and escaped unharmed. The aftermath of both of these stories is about what you would expect, but in the Moore case, there was a particularly tragic twist. Squeaky Fromm was convicted of attempted assassination of the President of the United States and given a life sentence. At the time, Deputy District Attorney Stephen Kay alleged that Charles Manson had a hand in the assassination attempt, though that was certainly never proven. Fromm was granted parole in 2008, but had time added to her prison sentence due to a 2-day prison escape in 1987. She was ultimately released in August 2009 after serving 34 years in jail. Fromm is still alive today. She's still loyal to and in love with Charles Manson. Sarah Jane Moore pled guilty to the attempted assassination of the president. She, too, was sentenced to life in prison. At her sentencing, Moore said, "Am I sorry I tried? Yes and no. Yes, because it accomplished little except to throw away the rest of my life. And no, I'm not sorry I tried, because at the time it seemed a correct expression of my anger." Interestingly, in 1979, Moore also escaped prison. She was captured hours later and had more time added to her sentence. Now, it's really worth noting that the judge in Moore's case publicly stated that, had Moore had her gun, he believed her attempt to kill Ford would have been successful. Moore was released on parole on December 31st, 2007, after 32 years in jail. In later interviews, she stated that she was glad she missed and expressed regret for her actions. Perhaps the saddest twist of this entire case is that of Oliver Seipel. Seipel was a former Marine. He's the man who grabbed Moore's arm after she fired the first shot at Ford, potentially saving his life. Originally, Seipel was hailed as a hero and received a letter of commendation and thanks from President Ford. The issue? Seipel was gay. Now, obviously, no one should care about this, but this was 1975, and at the time it was much harder to live a life out of the closet. Seipel was active in San Francisco's gay community, but his family didn't know that he was gay. His sexual orientation was disclosed to the San Francisco Chronicle by a local activist group and famous San Francisco councilman Harvey Milk, a gay man himself who allegedly viewed Seipel's heroism as an opportunity. But Seipel was outed against his will. He didn't even want his name disclosed at first, and his mother disowned him based on his sexual orientation. Now, reports differ on whether or not the family ultimately reconciled, but there was a rift for many years in the relationship between Seipel and his parents, with his father not even allowing Seipel to attend his mother's funeral. Seipel's mental and physical health would suffer. He drank heavily and was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. He would later confess to friends that he wished he had never grabbed the gun. Seipel died in 1989. He was 47. This was obviously a bad 17-day period for Ford, but thankfully, there were no other attempts on his life. From that moment on, he would wear a bulletproof trench coat during public appearances. Ford would lose the 1976 presidential election to President Jimmy Carter. He died in 2006 at the age of 93. Gerald Ford holds the honor of being the only man in history to serve as president even though he was never elected president or vice president. For those of you who study history, you may remember that Ford was appointed Richard Nixon's vice president after the resignation of Spiro Agnew, then became the president when Nixon resigned. Had either assassination attempt been successful, Ford would have been succeeded by Nelson Rockefeller, his vice president. Rockefeller was the governor of New York, and often regarded as a more moderate or liberal Republican. Putting aside the obvious impact that this would have had on Ford's policies, there is no question that history would have been very different. In 1976, Ford barely won the Republican nomination for president, needing to fight off a primary challenge from California Governor Ronald Reagan, who challenged Ford as a more conservative alternative. Ford would beat Reagan, but it is likely that Rockefeller, a more liberal alternative, would have had a much tougher time against Reagan. This begs the question, would Ford's assassination have begun the Reagan Revolution early? What impact would this have had on the policies of a Reagan presidency and on the Republican Party as a whole? Where would we be today? And that is it for this assassination-related edition of Almost Something. As always, I would love to know what you think. Please like the video, please comment below with video ideas, and most importantly, this is, as always, my most important ask, if you like these videos, please subscribe. Subscribing helps more people see the video, and it lets me know that I am on the right track. Thank you, my friends. Have a wonderful day out there, and as always, don't let there be any almost in your life.